This is a weird question, but have you ever felt like a lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots? Or is that just me? Let me explain. When I got into medical school, I told myself that I would be a more active member of my student body. This was something that I regretted not doing in college. To get involved, I decided to join student leadership for a number of reasons. One, I had this past leadership experience in JROTC, sports, and research, and I felt that I could use that skill set. Two, as a Filipino American and lesbian, I felt that there was a clear lack of representation in leadership. And three, I felt that if I ever wanted to affect changes, I needed to have a seat at the table. I ended up being in student leadership for 4 years, and most of the time, I felt like the lone pink dot. From the classrooms to conference rooms, from group projects to leadership teams, I felt different. And it wasn't until my final year of student leadership that I was able to frame these feelings as emotional tax. The Catalyst defines emotional tax as the heightened experiences of being different from peers because of gender and/or race or ethnicity, and the associated detrimental effects on health, well-being, and the ability to thrive. These experiences can be pretty significant for BIPOC folks, for folks in the LGBTQIA+ community, or for underrepresented leaders, such as myself, who fear being stereotyped, fear receiving unfair treatment, or fear feeling like the other in the group, or fear feeling like that lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots. So I'll ask again, have you ever felt like a lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots? And if you have you ever struggled with how taxing it could be? I imagine that some of you might say yes now, and that some of you might even be feeling validated or seen. I know that I felt validated once I started to recognize these feelings as the emotional tax of being an underrepresented leader. And once I recognized this, I began to look at my leadership experiences through a different lens. My final year in student leadership was 2020 to 2021, or the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. During that year, I clocked over 500 hours into my role. I went to over 150 meetings, and I sent over 1,000 emails. I'm sure you can imagine how stressful that year was, especially with anxiety levels at an all-time high, with hate crimes being on the rise, and with everyone being quite opinionated on the right courses of action to take. During that year, I began to recognize more and more what was taxing for me and perhaps for others. I felt that more often than not, individuals who I thought were qualified for roles would tell me they couldn't do what I do because of the amount of work a role required or because of how taxing the role could be. I also felt that more often than not, individuals were leaving positions or being pushed out. I saw this untapped potential simply because environments weren't set up for them to thrive. And while I truly believe that organizations could do more to minimize or mitigate emotional tax, after all of my years in student leadership, I put together a subjective guide for underrepresented leaders based off of the lessons I've learned as someone who had to first recognize and then navigate emotional tax. And I'd love to share my 10 lessons learned with you now. Number 1, be kind. I believe in putting positive energy out there and thus try to be kind to others. I also believe that it's taxing to hold on to any negative energy, that's sent my way, whether that be in the form of stereotyping, unfair treatment, or microaggressions? Why hold on to all that anger and pain when I could just be kind to myself and let it go? 2, be real. Another way to put this is be authentic. An article from the Center of Creative Leadership described authenticity as when internal values and beliefs align with your external behavior. It is making life decisions and doing my job without compromising my values, my beliefs, or my personality. It's me doing me. With that said, this is easier said than done, especially for individuals who don't automatically fit in. And I learned that it was emotionally taxing trying to balance wanting to fit in and wanting to be real. But I discovered that being real and not sacrificing myself for a role allowed me to sleep at night. I would think, how could I live with myself if I wasn't being myself? Or what was the point in bringing representation to the table if I was just going to mold myself to be like everyone else at that table? 3, be mindful. Sometimes I would go through my day-to-day life and I wouldn't take the time to process what happened to me. And sometimes I would reach a tipping point without noticing, and that wasn't healthy. Therapy taught me mindfulness techniques, and it taught me to take the time each day to process so I didn't get stuck in a rut. I learned to be self-aware, to be aware of my moods, my emotions, and my motivations. And I learned to listen to my body, to listen to how it reacts to stressors and how it reacts to emotional attacks. And once I did that, I learned to take the important step of setting boundaries, because why would I continue to go into situations that were detrimental to my health? Or why would I continue to go into environments that made me feel extremely uncomfortable? I learned the importance of setting boundaries, especially with the goal of protecting my mental health and wellness. 4, be humble. I used to think I had to be the best, or at least pretend I had to be the best, or present myself like I was the best. And I would regret not knowing an answer to a question because I thought my worth was tied to knowing all of the answers. And I feared what other people would think of me if I didn't. But this was taxing. It was taxing to be that prepared. It was taxing to be, or to try to be the best. And it was taxing to try to pretend to be the best. It took me some time, but I learned to recognize that I'm just one person and that I'm only human. And that if I didn't know an answer to a question, I probably could find someone who did. And if I didn't know how to perform a role, I probably could find someone who could. I came to this university as a humble, lifelong learner. And remembering that aspect of myself lifted a weight off of my shoulders. In this way, be humble is simply a reminder that I'm always growing, I'm always improving, and I'm always learning from those around me. And that's okay. 5, be patient. I personally appreciate instant gratification, and thus I thought affecting change needed to happen now, or I really wanted it to happen now. And it was taxing to be met by failure after failure, or what I felt were tiny steps of progress forward and giant steps back. But I had this conversation with a mentor, and they reminded me that changes can be slow, and that progress isn't linear, and that any amount of progress, no matter how small, is still progress, and that any amount of progress that may eventually affect major changes may just not happen in my lifetime or in my time at this university, but that didn't make it any less important. It's like I'm planting seeds, and I wouldn't go digging those seeds back up just from a few days of no growth. Instead, I would allow the seeds the time it needed, and I would give the seeds the nurturing it needed for it to grow and thrive. 6, be connected. I learned to vibe check those around me to get a feel for who may be a good ally, or who may be a good accomplice, or who may be an opposer of me. And I learned to take the time to find the allies who would be supportive and to find the accomplices who would be active in helping me with the work. And though sometimes taking this extra time could be taxing, I learned that I couldn't get a good feel for someone from a 1-hour meeting. So I tried to be actively engaged. I tried to be actively engaged in getting small talk and getting those one-on-one conversations, because being connected goes beyond networking. It's building relationships. Of note, these connections and these relationships, they don't change my situation as being the lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots. But it did lessen the emotional tax, because I knew I had allies and I knew I had accomplices who I can lean on if needed. With that said, I caution to be vigilant. Not all connections are going to be good connections. Not all relationships can be built into something great or something long-lasting. I learned to trust my gut and to trust that actions speak louder than words, and to trust that some words are just lip service. And I learned the hard way to not overshare and to not show all of my hand, because the more I gave someone, the more they had to use against me, and the more reasons they might have to treat me differently, and the more tax I had to pay as a result. And though it could be taxing to be on guard like this all of the time, I learned that being vigilant, especially when making new connections, can prevent even more tax in the future. 8, be supported. I learned to surround myself with other BIPOC folks and other folks from the LGBT+ community and other underrepresented individuals, because I knew they understood me better than anyone else could. I supported them and they supported me. And as we made efforts to affect changes together, we were able to lessen emotional tax by being there for each other. 9, be thoughtful. Being thoughtful is thinking before acting and not just reacting. I learned to be cautious of my words and actions. I learned to think of how my words and actions can be perceived and how actions can have a ripple effect. Being thoughtful is also being open-minded and asking questions like, why does this table exist in the first place? Who decided who to invite to that table? And why did they invite me, of all people, to join that table? Being thoughtful is also thinking beyond myself. For instance, I don't have to be a lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots, because there is a potential for more. Like, I may be a woman of color, and I may be a lesbian, but I am not the only person with a BIPOC perspective, and I'm not the only person with the LGBT+ QIA perspective. I also learned that my leadership positions open doors for me. And perhaps something I should do is hold the door open for others, because maybe me having that seat or me having the seat at that particular table isn't the solution. Being thoughtful is also going a step further. It's thinking, what if I just create my own table? And what if I were able to create a safe space for individuals to be authentic? And what if I was able to create an environment for that limited or got rid of emotional tax altogether? What could we accomplish if we started from scratch like this? And finally, 10, be intentional. If no good deed goes unpunished, then I better make sure it counts. If I'm worried about stress and taxation, then I better make sure that my actions have intention behind it, so that my actions aren't wasted and my actions are worth it. In this way, intentionality focused me. So I try to be intentional in all that I do. I'm intentionally kind. I'm intentionally real. I'm intentionally mindful, humble, and patient. And I'm intentionally connected, vigilant, and supported. And I'm intentionally thoughtful. I learned to be intentional about recognizing and navigating emotional tax. I learned to be intentional about being supported and supportive and surrounding myself with like-minded individuals with common goals. And I learned to be intentional about pushing through setbacks and failures and celebrating progress, no matter how small. I learned to be intentional about getting through those barriers and holding the door open for others and uncovering the untapped potential of other underrepresented individuals. And I learned to be intentional about not being the lone pink dot among mostly white polka dots. I learned to be intentional about bringing other pink, blue, orange, and green dots to the table. And I learned to be intentional about finding ways to thrive with those other dots to create a better, brighter, more colorful future. Thank you.